Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Ginger Gosnell-Myers. I'm Niska and Kwakwakwiwak. I am coming to you from the Squamish Nation community of Eslaon. I do a lot of my work in the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I think it's really important when we're acknowledging the land that we're on that we recognize the significant number of actions and responsibilities that should come with this acknowledgement. And I think our talk today is one really good opportunity for us to understand what action in recognition of the unceded Indigenous homelands that we're on can look like. I imagine that there are those of you who are on lands that aren't of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh homelands. So please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're coming to us from today. Thank you. I have some housekeeping items to take care of. First off, we have closed captioning available. It's available on Zoom by clicking the More button at the bottom of your screen and then clicking the View Subtitle. Thank you, AI Media, for providing this service, and please let us know in the chat if you're having difficulties accessing the closed captioning function. We'll have our staff at SFU to help guide you through this. If you are joining us from a desktop or a laptop, then you will notice that we have ASL English interpretation available for today. Thank you to our interpreters for being with us. Right now we have Michelle taking care of this. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'd also like to note that this lecture is being recorded and will be available on the SFU Public Square website and YouTube channel. The recording is also going to be sent to all registrants after the event. We are also going to be having some opportunities for those of you to both connect with us in the chat, also submit questions during the Q&A portion of the event. We ask that you remain incredibly respectful in your communications with us through chat and through questions. We do have community guidelines that are in place to ensure that there is safety for all of the guest speakers and event participants. We want to ensure that we have an honest, socially accountable dialogue, and the community guidelines will be posted in the chat for you to read. We would like to recognize that we are here to be respectful of one another's views and opinions, and that we are all here to learn. I will note that we will have zero tolerance for those who promote violence or discrimination against others. So thank you everyone in advance for the respectful conversation that we are going to have today. With that, to get started on our event, From Structural Racism to Personal Practices, Embodying Anti-Oppression for Reconciliation, I would like to introduce to you the Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives, Rajna Singh, to say a few words. Rajna Singh was elected as the MLA for Surrey Green Timbers in May 2017 and re-elected in October 2020. Rajna moved from India to Canada in 2001 and chose Surrey to build a better life for her young family. She has worked as a drug and alcohol counselor, a support worker for women facing domestic violence. She is a community activist who has 2 children and is married to radio journalist Gurpreet Singh. So thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Rajna Singh, for your words with us today.
Thank you so much, Ginger, and I'm so honored to be here, and thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm grateful to be speaking to you all from the shared territories of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, Kwikwetlam, Kwantlen, Kikite, and Swasan First Nations. I'm grateful for the histories, traditions, perspectives, and ways of life that continue to nurture this great province. And as a representative of government, a settler to these lands, and an advocate for racial justice, I'm very much looking forward to engaging in today's lecture that asks us to hold on to the spirit of reconciliation as we think about the systemic and the personal. And I really want to thank the Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network and Simon Fraser University for bringing these brilliant thinkers and activists to inspire us to take action. And I'm so proud to see Resilience BC continue to do incredible work as it moves into its second year since we launched this program in 2019. And one of the reasons our government created Resilience BC was to ensure that we are investing in grassroots communities to fight racism. And the work of the network really enables us to take a more informed and coordinated approach to address racism in this province. I'm really grateful for the impact that our many Resilience BC spokes are doing, like what they are doing in their own communities. But we also recognize that as a government, we continue to work with a legacy of colonization and discrimination against Indigenous and racialized peoples. I'm honored as the Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives to be mandated to work on the legislations and mandated to take action and shift our government to be more equitable and just. One of the many initiatives that I'm very excited about is our ongoing work to introduce new anti-racism data legislation. As we build this legislation, we are looking to hear your thoughts, experiences, and stories to help us better address systemic discrimination. You can participate in our engagement process by visiting engage.gov.bc.ca/anti-racism/data. There is a survey on this site that closes on November 30th. And for the first time, I really want to say this survey is one of its kind. Governments have never used this kind of survey. This really asks about the experiences that you have felt, especially dealing with the public service. We also, along with the survey, we are also funding up to 30,000 available for the communities wishing to host their own conversations. One thing that was made clear to us that the communities want to do their own consultations, and this funding would help them do that. The applications for those grants close soon. So please spread the word. We would like many people to apply for that and do this consultation. What I have shared with you so far is just a little bit of the work that our government is doing to tackle systemic racism in our province. We have many programs on the go, but we also know that we have much more work to do. However, systemic change requires us all to do our own individual work to truly achieve the change. And by being here, you are on that journey with me as we tackle racism in British Columbia. Audiences like yourselves bring me hope that we are going to be okay, as long as we all commit to taking action as we go. Friends, I'm so pleased that we are able to learn together with Dr. Eva Jewell and Ginger Gosnell-Myers, and I'm honored to join President Johnston to launch the Taking Action lecture series today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Singh, for that. And good to know some of the initiatives that are coming down through the province. And thank you again for your support of this event and speaker series. I would like to share a message from SFU President Joy Johnson, who unfortunately is unable to be with us in person, but she has recorded a video introducing the Taking Action speaker series, including SFU's partnership with Resilience BC, Anti-Racism Network, and she will also be introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Eva Jewell. So can we get that video started?
Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Singh. Let me begin by saying that I am privileged to be speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I know you're as eager as I am to hear from today's speaker. Racism is part of our world, part of our communities, and part of SFU's campuses. What we have witnessed over the past couple of years tells us that there is a need for increased urgency to address racism in BC. A need to take province-wide action towards combating anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and hate and discrimination in all forms. Universities like Simon Fraser University originate from Eurocentrism, colonialism, and bureaucracies that reinforce systems of power and privilege and can leave many on the margins. We have the responsibility to dismantle these structures and systems as we strive to create a more inclusive, equitable, and just society. At SFU, we have work ahead of us to undo systemic barriers that prevent people from feeling accepted, from being their true selves, and from accessing the resources and privileges that can make the university experience such a transformative one. We cannot do this alone. We need collective efforts and collective insights to make real change. That's why SFU is so pleased to partner with the Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network, a program funded by the province of BC to support the network's province-wide approach to identifying and challenging racism through delivering accessible resources for education, community building, dialogue, issues identification, and mobilization. This partnership will help us build momentum towards our own anti-racism efforts while giving us the opportunity to collaborate and learn from others to create change both within and beyond SFU's campuses. As part of the partnership, Resilience BC and SFU Public Square will host Taking Action, a lecture series designed to stimulate discussion about successful and adaptable strategies to end racism and hate. I'm honored to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of this series. Today, Eva Jewell, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Sociology at X University, currently known as Ryerson University, and Research Director at the Yellowhead Institute, will discuss how we can embody anti-oppressive practices as preparation for reconciliation. Many thanks to Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network and SFU Public Square for hosting this series. This is just the beginning of what I know will be an important partnership. I look forward to your discussions and cannot wait to see what we accomplish together.
Thank you to President Johnson for that generous overview of this partnership and the upcoming speaker series. I am incredibly honored to be part of this event and to introduce you to Dr. Eva Jewell, who is our speaker for the day. She is Anishinaabe from Deshkanzibing, the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation in southwestern Ontario. And she also has paternal Haudenosaunee lineage from Oneida Nation of the Thames. Dr. Jewell is a co-author of the yearly Calls to Action Accountability, a status update on reconciliation report, and her scholarship supports community-led inquiry on topics of language, governance, and cultural resurgence amongst Anishinaabe people. Dr. Jewell is the research director at the Yellowhead Institute and an assistant professor in Indigenous feminisms in the sociology department at X University. If you haven't had a chance to check out the wonderful resources and research at Yellowhead Institute, I urge you to go through it. There's incredible truth in here about the impacts of colonialism, as well as some direction on the work that needs to take place for decolonization. Of course, Dr. Jewell is going to be going through a lot of her work on structural racism. And with that, I would like to call forward Dr. Eva Jewell to tell us more about a lot of these, I think, timely insights through her work. Dr. Jewell.
Bonjour, Chimigwech Ginger. I'm just so honored to be here today. Bonjour, Nindwe Magnidok Kinawea, Wawi Bitcoin Coindish Nakas, Dishkanzi Bing and Donjuba. Anishinaabe Kwendao. My name is Eva Jewell, and I am a Nishanim Eekwei from Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, and that is in Southern Ontario, and that's where I actually joining you today from my First Nation and from my territory of the Anishinaabe, and it's home now to the Haudenosaunee as well as the Lenni Lenape. So I just wanted to say Chimigwech to all the kind folks who have been helping with technologies and to those who have invited me to speak today. And I want to especially thank my colleague, Carol Bilson, whose labor complements mine. And I hope one day that we can collaborate together and actually provide a robust presentation of this work, since a lot of our work was meant to be delivered together. But I thank you all for joining me today to engage with some of my work. So this photo is of the Walnut Grove near my childhood home, which was on the former grounds of Mount Elgin Indian Industrial School. And it was the second residential school in Canada and a model for Canada's system that would ultimately impact millions of our lives as Indigenous peoples. When he was a young boy at this institution, my grandfather would gather walnuts from these trees and stash them for food over the winter, which I'm told that he shared with his peers when they were hungry. So this talk emerges from my work on the 5x5 review, which was a toolkit on structural racism that I wrote for the Yellowhead Institute in February 2020. And it accompanied a brief authored by Nikki Sanchez on the links between systemic racism and the racism that Indigenous peoples face daily in this country, even in what many would consider a mundane task, such as opening a bank account. And so at that time, the brief dealt with the infamous BMO incident, where Haudenosaunee Nation member Maxwell Johnson and his granddaughter, Torianne, were arrested during their attempt to open a bank account for the 12-year-old Torianne. The pair were using their Indian status cards for identification, which the bank employee did not recognize as being a legitimate form of ID. And what's more, because Maxwell had a large sum of money in his account from a recent settlement, the bank employee grew suspicious of the pair. The employee told their manager, who called Indigenous Services Canada, who recommended the bank call the police. And from there, things escalated into the eventual arrest of Maxwell and his granddaughter. And this became national news after Angela Sterrett, a member of the Gitxsan Nation, broke the story for CBC. And in my mind, it was powerful for a few reasons. It showed the ongoing Canadian ignorance of Indigenous reality, the bank employees' lack of knowledge about Indian status cards in a major Canadian city where tens of thousands of First Nations individuals live and work daily. It showed ongoing biases in the structure of this country, where the employees and racial biases that a visibly non-white person possessing a significant amount of money was suspicious, the Indigenous Services employee whose presumptions summoned the police, and the subsequent police response, which resulted in the arrest of the pair. And it showed the ongoing violence of the carceral system. At no point in these encounters did anyone seem to ask any clarifying questions. And if they did, Maxwell and his granddaughter were not believed. The seemingly appropriate response to all parties involved in this incident was to invoke the carceral system against an elder and a child. And while encounters like these may become media moments for the Canadian public, they are a lived and sustained reality for Indigenous peoples in this country. That is, they are baked into the structure of Canada and its ongoing suppression of Indigenous peoples and nations. This incident was not a one-off, but rather evidence of systemic issues still at play. So at Yellowhead Institute, we were called to task to connect Maxwell and Torianne's traumatic experience to the broader structure of racism that Indigenous peoples face and have faced since the inception of this country. These systemic issues are, of course, well understood by the federal and provincial governments. And to give you a sense of this understanding, at least 5 times in the last 30 years, separate inquiries and commissions were struck in response to a seeming breaking point of injustice, such as the death of J.J. Harper and Helen Betty Osborne, which resulted in the Manitoba Justice Inquiry. the siege at Ganawage, also known as the Oka Crisis, which resulted in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the murder of Dudley George, which resulted in the report of the Ipperwash Inquiry, the system of genocide at Canada's residential schools, which resulted in the Truth and Reconciliation reports and calls to action, and the 1,000 plus known cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which of course resulted in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And this isn't even an exhaustive list of all the inquiries. The 2019 Kikitani Truth Commission investigating the impact of Canadian treatment of Inuit and the 1994 Task Force report on museums and First Peoples are just two notable inquiries that I did not include in the exercise. And these same systems and structures endure, causing incident and crisis again and again, continuing to cause harm. And this leaves me and many others wondering about what really needs to happen for things to change to the structures in this country. Even though these commissions and inquiries amounted to over 1,000 recommendations to change Canadian policies, structures, and institutions, the Canadian public and their political leaders still seem to be asking the question, what do we do? So the toolkit I produced to accompany Nikki Sanchez's brief was meant to illuminate just how many recommendations have been made by Indigenous intellectual labor in response to ongoing structural violence over the years. I reviewed the recommendations from these reports and inquiries in the last 30 years and categorized some of them in some of these recommendations into 5 themes related to structural racism to analyze the BMO incident, but also as a comment more broadly on what needs to change in order to address the structural inequities that Indigenous peoples continue to face. So I'm going to use some of the themes from the 5x5 toolkit to blend with some of my other work at the Yellowhead Institute and speak about how these translate into personal practices. And I hope you'll forgive me that I have limited time and cannot speak to all aspects of these themes. The first I want to talk about is I want to begin this portion by talking and linking contemporary reconciliation discourse to representation of Indigenous peoples in society more broadly. So reconciliation is the context that the Canadian public is familiar with when approaching the conversation regarding their country's systemic treatment of Indigenous peoples in this moment. And it's becoming one of the main conversations about Indigenous peoples. So last week on September 30th, Canada observed the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And as we know, in the 94 calls to action made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, number 80 was a call for the federal government to establish a national day to honor survivors of the system, their families and their communities, of course. And in May of this year, after years of work leading up to the announcement, Kamloops Tesequemic First Nation announced the finding of 215 remains in a mass grave outside of Kamloops Indian Residential School. The revelation shocked the country. Just days later, Bill C-5, the act containing the legislation for the new day of observance, was fast-tracked to royal assent. This bill had actually been introduced in September of 2020 and died in the Senate, according to Brian Massey of the NDP. And it was revitalized rather quickly after the world's attention was focused on evidence of Canada's genocide. But that day was quite complicated, I think. And to talk a little bit about why it was so complicated, I want to summon a piece by Stephanie Freiberg and her team, where past studies have shown that Indigenous peoples experience continued psychological harm when instances of anti-Indigenous violence are reported in the media. And there's actually a clear link between the lack of positive Indigenous representation and decreased well-being of Indigenous peoples. So in the 5x5 review, I had talked about how there's a need for positive, authentic representation in society of Indigenous peoples in society, because not only will this have benefits for Indigenous peoples, it can contribute to normalizing Indigenous presence and perspectives in this country. And so I want to tell and share with you that A personal practice can be resist tokenizing Indigenous peoples and asking us to perform trauma. And when engaging with Indigenous content, to resist asking only about the trauma that does not actually define us, right? And so I want to call upon Canadians to think more deeply about that authentic representation of Indigenous peoples in their own right. My animations are a little skewed here. So these barriers, so I'm looking at public education and awareness. And in 2017, an internal federal memo stated that the government of Canada faces challenges communicating effectively about, effectively to the public about Indigenous issues. And it was described as issues that are too complex and lacking immediacy for the general public. And in 2016, Environics research group studied Canadian sentiments around Indigenous peoples and found that 26% of Canadians view of Indigenous people, 26% of Canadians view Indigenous peoples as the biggest obstacles to their own economic and social equality. 26% viewed the Canadian government as the biggest obstacle. So we see kind of a split there in the Canadian public. And in 2021, that number has now shifted. So it is now 37% of Canadians viewing the Canadian government as the biggest obstacle, while 16% still view Indigenous peoples as their own barriers. And these barriers will be of interest to you, to those of you who are looking for ways to personally practice anti-oppression in this country, because some of them actually rely on the Canadian public's apathy. So this internal memo that we had obtained by access to information request actually kind of showed how the Canadian government is relying upon the apathy of Canadians to as an excuse, essentially, to as a way to describe the challenge or the barrier to meaningful implementation of many of the calls to action. And so I say to you, a personal practice to make an effort to learn about structural inequities, advocate that this information be more widely available, and make interventions into broader education about Indigenous peoples. And I believe it is possible that the revelations at Kamloops and the ongoing conversation around reconciliation has shifted Canadian sentiments, which possibly speaks to the impacts of the critical work that so many Indigenous scholars and Indigenous activists, grassroots and community have been doing to hold the federal government to account. Too often these issues are framed as Indigenous issues, right? And they are not. Right. So in the words of Mike Goldhawk, who's a Métis scholar and writer, they are in fact colonial issues rebranded as the fault of Indigenous peoples. And this distinction needs to be made clear in public education and awareness, because we see here the 16% of Canadians are still viewing Indigenous peoples as their own barriers and are still maintaining a racist mythology about the inequities that Indigenous peoples face in this country. In the last 2 years, I've co-authored a call to action accountability report with my colleague, Dr. Ian Mosby. And we've been finding that in 5 years since these calls were made, there has been a dismal record of implementation. Last year, there were no calls to action that were completed. And the year before that, just 2 were completed. So for a country that has claimed the most important relationship is the one that it has with Indigenous peoples, we assert that this is unacceptable. As Indigenous children's graves continue to be revealed outside of residential schools, there is a renewed public resolve for reconciliation, with specific attention paid to the calls to action. So here I want to remind folks of the nature of the calls to action, the purpose of them, which is 2 parts. The first being to redress the legacy of residential schools. The second being to advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. It's in our close reading of the calls to action that we maintain this each year, that the calls to action number 1 through 42 that deal with the ongoing legacy of the Indian residential school system in Canadian structures are those that are the least implemented. Calls 43 to 94 advance the process of reconciliation, and it is there where we see things like the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and some of those more Canadian public, Canadian accessible types of calls to action. And as of this date, most calls have been completed in number 43 through 94. So much of the structural recommendations that Indigenous peoples have called for have not actually been implemented. Throughout our research in the past few years, we've been very interested in learning about why there are barriers to meaningful implementation of those calls to action that seek to redress the ongoing legacy of residential schools. And I've asserted time and time again that those calls 1 through 42, of course, are those that will actually make a difference in Indigenous people's lives. And as of this date, they are the fewest that have been completed. So your personal practice is to track calls 1 to 42 and advocate for their completion. This is the work of Cindy Blackstock. This is the work that that impacted the instance of the crisis in health, where Joyce Echequan was basically murdered in care. So these are this is the really meat and potatoes in my view, as I've been doing a lot of this research. That's not to discount the importance of 43 through 94, but it is 1 through 42 that actually deals with the ongoing legacy of residential schools that continues to exist in Canadian structures today. So I've been asked, and in this work, we wanted to examine what the holdup is in creating that meaningful structural change to the Canadian structures that continue to harm Indigenous peoples. And we, in looking at a lot of the different issues that come up around the truth and reconciliation calls to action and reconciliation more broadly in the conversation, Dr. Ian Mosby and I had come up with these 5 thematic issues that seem to crop up throughout our examination of the calls to action implementation. We see the public interest, paternalism, structural racism, reconciliation as exploitation, and insufficient resources. In the first, the public interest, it seems, is always defined as being the interests of a non-Indigenous public that benefits from the direct violation of treaty relationships and the exploitation of Indigenous lands. So take, for example, Canada's ongoing legal challenges to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's September 2019 ruling. And of course, the federal government, the court has struck those appeals down again. But essentially, the federal government has willfully and recklessly discriminated against First Nations children in ways that have contributed to child deaths and a multitude of unnecessary family separations. And while the federal courts ruled against these appeals, Canada has publicly claimed that the order was not in public interest because of the billions of dollars that will need to be paid out to individuals unjustly taken from their families as children. And a new study by Dr. Edana Bouvet, who's also at Simon Fraser University, and whose work I'm very interested in, found that amongst Canadians who live where oil and gas projects are the main source of economic activity, resentment against Indigenous peoples is higher. So Indigenous peoples are, in the minds of many Canadians who live in these particular areas, are in direct competition with Canadian wealth. So attending to Indigenous issues for the Canadian government is often seen as going against the public interest. Again, here, this is where the federal government is using Canadians as a shield to do meaningful action and change within the structures of this country. Paternalism. So when Canada attempts to respond to the calls to action, many times it is done so without the meaningful input of Indigenous peoples, and hopefully we will see this one change. Many of these barriers to structural change, of course, I would be glad to see go away But the reality is that there is still an active sense of paternalism in the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. So for example, call to action number 13 regarding the acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights was considered complete in principle through the passing of the Indigenous Languages Act. But several concerns arose regarding the meaning of such an act when the funding does not match the aspiration. So the act essentially did not address the unique challenges of Inuktitut speakers, a fact that Inuk leaders attempted to address in their review of the bill before it received royal assent, only to have their suggested revisions scrapped. So it's clear in this particular example it's clear in this particular example that paternalism is continuing to be a barrier to meaningful change when Canada attempts to respond to the calls to action. So we should expect that equity, at least in decision-making, to be a core principle of a conciliatory relationship. Next, we have structural racism, which of course, many times I've alluded to in a lot of my work. So the calls to action that have seen the least progress at all are those that call for fundamental changes to the policies and institutions built from the start on a foundation of anti-Indigenous racism. So for instance, not only has the federal government refused to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, as outlined in call number 47, but this legal fiction continues to be the basis of Canadian claims to sovereignty on unceded Indigenous lands. And this position has been upheld by the courts despite its racist origins as a tool of European imperialism. This one is particularly disheartening to see as reconciliation becomes a more mainstream conversation in Canada. There is a fear, I think, for many Indigenous peoples that this will become the new form of exploitation and recolonization, as I've put it in the past. Canadian institutions are actually advancing predatory and exploitative practices in their reconciliation agendas, since reconciliation is taking place in environments that have not actually addressed their colonial paternalistic attitudes. And so the result is exploitation of Indigenous practitioners and communities. And this is evidenced in Yaz Morgan's extensive report, also by the Yellowhead Institute, or published at the Yellowhead Institute, that describes reconciliation as a culture of exploitation. So in the few cases where reconciliation purportedly occurs on a national scale, non-Indigenous administrators, institutions enacting these calls to action end up marginalizing, tokenizing, and exploiting Indigenous peoples in their process. So I would like for you to think and reflect deeply on the culture at your organization and the possibility that you are enacting and embodying practices that, again, marginalize, tokenize, and exploit Indigenous peoples. And finally, we have insufficient resources. And we found last year that Indigenous peoples wronged by the federal government are in conflict with the public interest, owing in part to the fact that these wrongs would require billions to be paid out in compensation. And this also connects to what we are consistently told as Indigenous peoples, that we cannot have jurisdiction back, that we cannot have land back, that we cannot have our cash back, as the the recent Yellowhead Red Paper describes in more detail, and I highly recommend that you take time to read that document. So while there's no shortage of promises made by federal and provincial governments, there are ongoing and rampant funding inequities, and that means there can never be meaningful reconciliation. And so, of course, this is pitted in competition with Canadians' public interest as well. I wanted to talk about reconciliation. I have just a few more minutes here, so I'm just going to talk really quickly about this, but maybe we can chat more about this in the question and answer period. But reconciliation has been described by Creve scholar Michelle Daigle and Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson as a management of settler feelings. And this simply isn't about Canadians. So this is about changing the structures that harm Indigenous peoples daily. Dr. Mosby and myself have also argued that implementing the calls to action are actually the bare minimum in achieving equity for Indigenous peoples. Our aspirations beyond equity and parity for futures where we are people in our own rights are additional labor on top of the calls to action. And so much of my work is just holding government, the work that I do, a lot of the thinking I do, the labor that I do as a scholar is simply asking for the very bare minimum that the federal government has promised. And so that's not to mention even just the reclamation work that we need to be doing in our own communities for our languages, our cultures, and our ways of life, essentially. So I was really interested to see this past summer that at least 3 calls to action were completed since the first findings of children's graves at Kamloops Indian Residential School on May 27th. And I share this very preliminarily because I have yet to look at the, Dr. Mosby and I are still doing our research for this year's report. But we saw the fast track completion of at least 3 calls to action in as many weeks. And that was more movement on the calls to action in 1 month alone than in the last 3 years. I've said this before, and I'm not really sure what it's going to take if these 3 calls to action, which are again, we're already kind of in the works of being done anyway. What's going to happen, what's going to need to happen for that structural change to take place if the discovery or the revelation of children's graves is what pushed through these 3 calls to action. So I think that's something that we really need to reflect about and think about. I think, Canadians should be really thinking about that. I'm going to end here with personal practices that I've just personally thought about. The embodiment of anti-oppressive practices are actually more of the work of my colleague, Carol Bilson. And our pieces were supposed to be shared collaboratively and together. But of course, because this is such a massive topic, our pieces were actually split apart. So what I can tell you about personal practices is that you need to inform yourself. There are over 1,000 recommendations in the last 30 years from reports on Indigenous issues. And there's been a lot of Indigenous labor put into the solutions that that we think can possibly repair or to at least bring us to a point of equity and justice. Many of the low-hanging fruit are currently in the works right now, but those big structural changes, the things like land back and cash back, the change to justice systems in this country and health and child welfare, those are definitely going to be quite a challenge to address, I think. So we at least need a populace that is informed about the issues, the structural issues at play and what needs to happen to change them. Reconciliation is systemic. It cannot be solely individual, but of course you can make a difference. Dr. Hayden King and myself have called this acts of low-key treason against a settler colonial state that you benefit from, or that a Canadian benefits from. So these are ways that we can interrogate our privileges, interrogate your privilege as a Canadian, and how you benefit from the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples and lands. Hold your governments accountable and demand action to address this country's ongoing settler colonial violence. I recently did a media piece where a First Nations caller had called in and said, during National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, all these Canadians are reflecting and thinking quite a bit about their role in truth and reconciliation. And yet he was very disturbed at how he had seen Canadians vote and wondered how sincere Canadians are because still electing people in who are upholding problematic structures of power and benefiting from them. Understand that settler colonialism is a structure that Canadians participate in daily, and that discomfort can be transformative, right? So I'm interested in this idea, not so much of reconciliation, but of an idea from scholar Waziatowin, who's a Dakota scholar. And she talks about this idea of contrition, and that is action from a space of apology, so it's activating your sorry, right? Make meaningful and self-aware steps to learning more and creating change with that knowledge. So the government relies on your apathy and relies on the ignorance of Canadians to continue to be to continue the inaction in terms of change more broadly to the structures that harm Indigenous peoples. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, give the land and the cash back. Think very deeply about what it means to restore, and what does restitution mean in this country. So I ask that you think deeply about advocating for restitution. So with that, I'd like to say Miigwech, and I'm looking forward to a question and answer period. I want to leave space for us to chat as well. So thank you kindly.
Thank you, Eva. You clearly have thought a lot about the impacts of colonialism in a modern context. And I have a lot of questions. I'm sure folks have a lot of questions as well. I'm wondering if you can comment on how much has changed for Canadians' understanding of Indigenous peoples, the emergence of reconciliation as a concept that really resonated with Canadians, and I think drove them to voicing more support for Indigenous issues. There's been a lot of learning done in the last few years in comparison to years prior, before the TRC commission took off. And, I'm wondering if you have any commentary on why reconciliation seemed to work more to change Canadians' attitudes, and where do you go from reconciliation? We talk about action and political will, but we see that this is a learning journey for many, stemming from something that I think kind of shocked most Indigenous peoples. Like, wow, reconciliation is finally what made people pay attention.
That's a great question. I think it was an opportunity to come into relationship with Indigenous peoples in a way that I can see why a lot of folks are very skeptical of it, because it's nice. Reconciliation is nice, right? There's, I think, just the focus on reconciliation and repairing Canada's maybe image, or doing the damage control, is something that made it so that it was resonating. I personally want to see much more structural change before I believe reconciliation is a possibility, because I am in agreement with Michelle Daigle and Audra Simpson that it is a method to manage the feelings of being complicit or in being a part of a country that has enacted a genocide, when the mythology of this country is that this is a human rights leader in the world, right? And many Canadians really have a felt attachment to that particular narrative. And reconciliation is a method or a mode to repair that that disruption of the narrative, I think. I don't want to appear, I don't know how to say it. I'm very conscious that it can seem like I'm very cynical and flippant or dismissive, but I think Canadians also have to really just reckon with that too, and just be okay with that, because there's a lot that has happened in this country for Indigenous peoples to be extremely cynical about.
I think that cynicism is earned and to be expected. And maybe if you're not cynical when it comes to understanding Indigenous issues and reconciliation and decolonization in this country, then maybe you aren't informed enough. I think, from a lot of my work and understanding Canadian attitudes, they tend to veer towards wanting to like worship the romanticism of indigenization and only think about, the good things or the art, less so on a lot of the actions that need to take place. I can see one of the questions in the Q&A is on abolishing the Indian Act. And I think that's a really good point on how, we can talk about reconciliation, but we still have an Indian Act. And you talk so much about the role of paternalism from the Canadian government when it comes to solving Indigenous peoples or trying to, solve the Indian problem, which is a term on its own. Can we have reconciliation and an Indian Act?
I think that is like the perfect way to kind of sum up the problem of reconciliation and why so many people are cynical about it. The Indian Act is, so many scholars have said it so much more succinctly and more elegantly than I'm going to say it, but it's abolishing it also makes me shift in my seat. I'm like, what does that mean? Because we did have an experience in 1969 where the abolishment of the Indian Act was very much rooted in, again, another paternalistic approach to solving the issue. So I think just the maddening thing about all of it is that Indigenous peoples are presenting the solutions the way that we want to see them, but that could never be imaginable to the Canadian public because that's too radical, that's too out there. It compromises the state, right? And again, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of course, being adopted and being looked at as an aspirational document, but includes that very last article saying all of this is really nice, but none of it can ever compromise the state. None of it could never do away with the Canadian state. I don't see the creation or the existence of the Canadian state as a space of justice for Indigenous peoples when its existence is so paternalistic and so violent as a structure daily. So right now in Wet'suwet'en territory and Gidimt'en, they're removing them from their territory. They said no. The Wet'suwet'en said no pipeline in this territory. And with a smile and with a promise of reconciliation, they're removing the Wet'suwet'en from their territory. So to me, I don't see any any other perfect example of reconciliation than what's happening right now in Wet'suwet'en.
There's a lot of violence underway against Indigenous land and water defenders, and you talk a lot in your research about how many actions are taking place right now, with 1492 Land Back Lane, with the Joyce Echaquan inquiry results being released just yesterday. There are so many opportunities to really dig into a current issue, whether it's, Indigenous peoples, protecting their rights on the front lines, or whether it's Indigenous peoples fighting for human rights and dignity in the healthcare system. It seems like every time you turn on the news, we're hearing about, another injustice, another failed opportunity for governments to act in advance and get ahead of the issue, before things get worse. I'm thinking about our last federal election, where it seemed the dominant Indigenous political speaking note was around clean drinking water for First Nations communities. And it seems like we have less of an appetite on the political side towards dreaming and being innovative. And we have a question here about, Indigenous futurism and what a decolonized Canada looks like. And I know I'm really interested in Indigenous futurisms. You know, I'm incredibly inspired by the work that's taking place in New Zealand with the place names and people learning Maori language and settler New Zealanders learning the Maori language. And, you know, it's defining New Zealand as a unique place on earth. And then we look to Canada and it seems like, we can't even get past agreeing on, you know, something more than like clean drinking water is the thing that we want to talk about. Like, there's such a divide, you know, and I'm wondering if you have any commentary on the divide between something as basic as clean drinking water, which is top of mind for politicians, and then Indigenous futurisms. We have best practices in the world for Indigenous futurisms already. Like, how can we get from A to B in this country?
Absolutely, and clean drinking water being the very bare minimum. So I was kind of appalled that there was so much applause and showboating around clean drinking water. I just I'm not really impressed that in 2021 clean drinking water is now a term of reconciliation. That's a bare, basic human right that Indigenous peoples have had for millennia until the state of Canada invaded our territories. So it just feels a little like you know, the bully picked you up after he punched you in the face, and you know, now he wants an applause for picking you up. Like, I'm not very convinced on this point of decolonized futures. I think about capitalism and how it's basically leading to our climate crisis. Capitalism is a denial of the life and agency that our entire world has. It centers human beings as, and not even all human beings, some human beings, of course, along the lines of cis heteropatriarchy and whiteness, centers those particular human beings as being the most important. I think of a decolonized future where agency is extended beyond human beings, where we do actually see our world as a living being that we are a part of and that we rely upon and depend upon, and honoring that relationship. I see a world that is safe for children. We live in a very a world that is very violent toward children, a misopotic society, if you will, a society that hates children. And this actually could be linked to a lot of the violence and the issues that we see in the world because of the way that we treat children and stuff them away into schools for, you know, for hours at a time during the day. We don't even spend time with our kin because we're all working in the capitalist system to keep the capitalist system afloat. I see it's very, I know a lot of people have a hard time dreaming about a decolonial future, but I think if we just really reflect upon our daily lives and how much we work in a structure that really in many ways doesn't benefit us or our land or our world around us, you know, you can start to see all of the practices, the daily practices that could change in a liberatory future, I guess.
You know, what strikes me about these conversations that we're having, that are being led by you, Cindy Blackstock, it seems like that Indigenous women and the intersection of being a woman and an Indigenous person are really creating these new narratives and these new, I think, discourses around indigeneity, Indigenous rights, sovereignty, a decolonized future, that we haven't necessarily seen in our even more recent Indigenous political past. You know, I remember being a youth representative with the Assembly of First Nations and hearing the chiefs debate on whether or not they wanted to move forward with dismantling the Indian Act. which I thought was crazy. Like, why would chiefs be mostly male chiefs? Like 95% of the chiefs at that time were males. You know, honestly, talking about maybe not doing away with the Indian Act, maybe wanting to keep it. And it seems like Indigenous women are really leading a different path forward. I think a lot of the ideas around anti-capitalism views and lenses is exciting. You know, a child-centered world, an Indigenous rights-centered world, ocean-centered, solutions, as opposed to market-driven solutions, are things that I think people dream about, not just Indigenous peoples, but probably all Canadians can get behind. I'm wondering if you had some thoughts on the role of being, maybe not the role of, but the leadership of Indigenous women in this new resurgence of decolonization and Indigenous rights.
I think that's a great question. So I'm teaching Indigenous feminisms course right now, and I have been reflecting quite a bit on this, that it's Indigenous women that are the kind of movers and shakers of the contemporary movement, but kind of have always been. I think our societies very much revered women's roles or women's abilities. I shouldn't say roles. I don't want to. Roles is such a bad, like, such a poor English term for it. And sometimes I find myself struggling because of the presence of patriarchy and misogyny about care work, about children, about dependence and interdependence. These are all settler colonial ideas that that these things are all bad. And so when women, and not even just women, I'm talking about feminized people, go into spaces of leadership and excel at it, because there is a knowledge, a felt knowledge, to summon some of the theory of Dr. Diane Millian, the felt knowledge and experience of community, of society, and an intimate understanding of what needs to happen, what needs to change to make things run smoother in life, just because of your proximity to it. When I think about all that, I just can see the clear natural connection between leadership and femininity, the decision making that we do for our communities and our societies, because of the close relationship that we have to the empowerment of essentially life. Again, I'm still developing my own voice on how to describe that in a way that that is resistant to those patriarchal narratives, that the role of giving life or sustaining life is something that is inherently devalued for women. And so I'm still thinking through my own understanding of the intersection of indigeneity and femininity. But for me, I see that space as being, I don't know, I've always seen it as a very empowering space. It's very empowering for me. I hope that answers the question.
I mean, if anything, it shows that, like, we need more space to really explore, these intersections, and also the future possibilities. What really strikes, I mean, there's a lot of things that strike me as, oh, wow, yeah, things have really changed. But one of the other things that, like, really strikes me is how far we've come as a Canadian society who used to rely on Indian Act chiefs as the main form of guidance on Indigenous issues. And it felt like young people were left out of those opportunities to have a voice. Indigenous women were left out of those opportunities to have a voice because the majority of Indian Act chiefs were men, and it felt like, this world to have a voice was completely shut off. Now that we're exploring, outside of an Indian Act reality, there are much more I think, interesting things to talk about as both solutions and new frames to look at some of these problems. One of the questions that we have here is from a municipal organization who says that they are on their own learning journey to develop relationships with First Nations in a respectful and meaningful way. So we have a city looking to develop relationships with First Nations, and they're interested in working with Indigenous peoples to break down their systemic barriers in their service delivery. So we have, instances of systemic oppression or barriers within a city structure, that is working against Indigenous peoples. This seems to be, one of the larger conversations that all organizations are having, not just because of the emergence of the TRC calls to action, really seems to be more of a reality stemming from Black Lives Matter, understanding that systemic racism exists. These were things that we didn't even say 2 years ago, but the emergence of Black Lives Matters has given us, a voice on identifying systemic racism as being real. Are there emerging best practices that you see on how these non-Indigenous organizations can bring Indigenous peoples in to be meaningful contributors and valued for their knowledge and efforts and ideas?
Yeah, I have a few ideas. I am just thinking about my own experience here. I've seen a few organizations approach in what I would consider not really the best way. And then I've seen other organizations approach in ways that really felt generative and respectful. And in the one example where it was generative and respectful was creating space for Indigenous, how do I say this, for Indigenous expression, authentic, as it originally emerges in an authentic expression, right? So in this situation, a city had asked my mother, who is an artist, to paint a mural, and essentially just said, here you go, here's the space, paint a mural, we want to feature your art. And that generative process, it's not just putting up a mural and that's nice and then you go away. There's a generative process there in the production of the mural, in the input of and the engagement with the organization, things like that. So you're really engaging the strength of a community and providing space for them to express themselves, essentially. That was just one example. So I'm not saying, go out and do that exactly, but that relationship building was really critical to that particular partnership. And over that relationship, and throughout that relationship, there was a lot of, subsequent relationships that were produced and created. And I ended up actually through another way from that same town, because they saw that there was a mural being painted, started to get really interested in saying, well, what's the history here? And we would like to reach out to your community and we want to start talking about our history together and things like that. And so I thought that was a really interesting entryway into a conversation. The other ways I've seen it not work so great is by there were some paternalistic kind of approaches, and that was, we're going to plan an event about you, without you, and then invite you to the event that we just planned for you. To the extent that they had flyers made, they had the date, they had everything picked, and then we're like, hey, come and join our event that's about you. And we were kind of like, where were we in any of this process? What, so the key part is about relationships, genuine relationships, and also being prepared to hear hard truths and perspectives from Indigenous peoples in that relationship, because I think that is this is the truth part of truth and reconciliation, is listening to the truth that Indigenous peoples have. And a lot of times we don't have great times in the towns near our reserves. Those are racist spaces for us. A lot of the towns around my reserve are extremely racist. And that conversation needs to happen too. So it's not all, tiptoe through the tulips. It's not all going to be really nice. There are some real conversations and reflections that municipalities need to be reflecting upon, because these are actually the spaces where Indigenous peoples are facing a lot of the violence, or the reserve, the towns near our reserves.
You know, it kind of ties into one of the other questions here that, you know, is talking about working in an education setting and seeing a tension between wanting to support the TRC calls to address systemic gaps within the education system, and also feeling that this could just be an act in supporting and training people who are just expected to code switch at the end of the day, and who aren't called to account when they're demonstrating colonial or harmful values, as opposed to integrating Indigenous values and norms. You know, you talk a lot in your research about the violence that Indigenous peoples experience in confronting systemic racism. I think being asked to code switch, I think organizations not having any accountability measures when faced with instances of, you know, values not being followed is becoming a norm. It kind of ties into, you know, the reconciliation industry that you talk about as well. You know, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on K-12 or university level on I think how to do better, or be better, or at least call for accountability in a meaningful way.
This one's tough because there's so many examples that, and so many little micro aggressions that exist every day that Indigenous peoples and all racialized peoples and you know, have to endure, because these spaces are like, our K-12 system reflects the Eurocentric system, right? So anyone who is not necessarily from that particular culture can face these issues. So I think it's really tough, because this is actually like, this was when we first were planning this, it was supposed to be my part, and then Carol was supposed to come in and tell people about those real microcosmic behaviors that exist in between and within organizations that create these types of tensions. But it's really about the behaviors like fostering sense of competition, fostering a sense of perfection, you know, things like the idea of perfect attendance, that we need to be good little like work people who have this perfect work ethic that reflects a Protestant standard. These types of, they're small nuances in the system, but they're actually the stuff that keeps the system together. You know, the whole activity that they have in schools that's like dress for success, and they ask you to come wearing business casual, or like come dress wearing a suit, or like things like that. These activities that actually reinforce colonial norms that are seen as harmless, right? It calls for an interrogation and a reflection on all the things that we take for granted, or that, you know, Canadians take for granted. I never went to a public school system, by the way, so this is really, it's kind of difficult. I feel like I'm shooting in the dark here, because I always went to school on reserve, where, you know, there was at least more of an understanding that there, you know, at least we were kind of more fostered in our community, culture, and language. But it takes really interrogating all the little ways that you pass on white supremacy and Eurocentrism, and reflecting on how to make that more an inclusive space. I apologize that I can't be a little more specific, because I don't know exactly what particular context you know, you may be speaking from or about, but I absolutely agree with you in terms of reconciliation just becoming a kind of buzzword that people can say, but then on the other hand, they're not doing the actual work of meeting, the actual work of interrogating their own white supremacist values.
Yeah, it looks like in the chat that you have answered that question and provoked, I think, more thinking around uh, how deep that issue is, or especially for Indigenous peoples working within the system. I think, you know, there's a recognition now that it is really tough to be an Indigenous person working in a system that expects you to adhere to a bunch of norms. Uh, and doesn't necessarily value the additions that you bring, you know, the Indigenous worldview and the community connections and a lot of those important contexts that these mostly colonial systems just were never built to understand or integrate. We're getting really close to the end of our time with you. There are many questions left in the Q&A. One that strikes me as really interesting, and I'm not sure if you will even be able to answer this, maybe just provide some commentary on it, is the emergence of the middle class as a focus in Canada, and if this focus on middle class families perpetrates patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist narratives that only reinforce settler apathy, or at least diverts their attention away from issues outside of their norms. We do see a lot of discussion on the middle class these days, and is this just a divergent tactic to take us away from like the meat and potato issues that Canada hasn't addressed through the myriad of inquiries that they still have to, you know, enact action on? Yeah. What are you thinking when you hear the middle class kind of taking over dominant narratives?
I think the middle class is an aspirational space that a lot of people don't fit into, but a lot of people do. And those who have privilege fit into those spaces and will fight to stay there. And I think the middle class is a categorization and a space that that needs to be protected. And it probably is capitalist propaganda. Absolutely, I would say it is capitalist propaganda. I don't want to say that we're all a monolith, because there are, you know, Indigenous peoples who are quite comfortable with, you know, the space of staying. How do I say this? Oh gosh. We're not a monolith, but I'm going to speak from my perspective, and my perspective is I am an anti-capitalist. I am not interested in a capitalist future. Because I think it's incredibly destructive. And one way to ensure that people buy into the future of a capitalist society is that they make their way into a middle class space where they're comfortable in this particular society. And I absolutely, yeah, I think the connection between reconciliation and it being targeted, or you know, the woke culture, as they say it, you know, they're co-opting the term, you know, woke problematically, I think is very, it's very reflective of a neoliberal culture. And this is what absolutely worries me about reconciliation being kind of the space where Canada wants to create a relationship with Indigenous peoples, but on their terms, that is informed by their niceties, informed by their culture of settler colonialism and capitalism. And it doesn't really interrogate the very real structures that are at play, which the middle class upholds. So you can, again, wear your orange shirt at school or at work at your 9 to 5, and then go home and feel like you did something. That's the type of reconciliation that I think that myself, and I'm sure many other Indigenous peoples, are very worried about Canada producing, particularly with this past National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which I'm still in lots of thoughts about and still processing myself. And if you want to share, Ginger, about what you think.
Yeah, I mean, when we were, you know, gearing up for today's event, like we had a really interesting conversation on like needing a debrief on how the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation went, and how, you know, it seemed a lot of the day's activities were led by residential school survivors themselves. We've seen our prime minister decide to take the day off and go, you know, hang out on a beach in Tofino instead. And it feels like, you know, reconciliation is being done in a comfortable, convenient form, without recognizing that things are going to have to be given up along the way, or that there might be some short-term pain in order for more widespread gain for Indigenous human rights to be recognized. And I'm hoping that next year on September 30th, we have more meaningful conversations on what the hard work actually looks like. I think the final question that, you know, I'll bring up is on how groups move towards reconciliation, organizations move towards reconciliation, relying upon Indigenous labor. You know, in my experience, they tend to bring Indigenous peoples in on precarious contract bases, or, you know, at a lower level or a more junior level, even with all of the experience and credentials. I don't know if you could hear my cat in the background. Sorry, it's a little weird. Can you provide, you know, some commentary to organizations on how they can better offer remuneration to Indigenous peoples in these organizations, you know, expected to do reconciliation work or Jedi work, or even, you know, non-Jedi work, but are expected to utilize their Indigenous lens to, you know, value add on top of a job that had nothing to do with reconciliation?
Oh my goodness, I feel like this is a question that has been answered by a Yellowhead report, and it wasn't. Well, I didn't author it, so I'm just going to pull it up while I reflect on it. This is a labor for Indigenous peoples, absolutely, and like you said, it oftentimes calls upon those that are precariously employed, and it can feel like a lot. I think there was some really interesting practices. It's how do I say this? It feels like a two-way street, and that is that I want to put it out to um, anybody who is employed by these types of contracts to really be assertive in the practices that you have. One person that I called upon, or I was interested in calling upon them, and so I went to their website and I saw that they had charged $150 just to get to know them, and that was you had to get to know them first, like as a consultation session to even start asking them for work. And I was like, yes, yes, do that. That's absolutely an important practice, and we need to be putting that into our budgets as organizations, that your very first approach to somebody who you're interested in having come into your organization, that there are spaces for this type of you know, cash pay. But I want to refer to Yaz Morgan's research, and I don't know if it was able to be put in the chat. It's the Yellowhead Institute's special report on reconciliation as exploitation. Sorry, it's called A Culture of Exploitation. And Yaz points out that there are, you know, of course, there are several suggestions about how to, you know, work with Indigenous peoples who are going to be providing a service of, you know, such as reconciliation to your organization. And one of them is ensuring the growth of Black and Indigenous culture workers into senior positions. So starting out, giving them opportunity to interview, you know, when you're providing mentorship, and then working it into the system that you do work them into a senior position. So make that as part of the plan before you even set out, that you make it a part of your organization. And, you know, putting one of the ones that they talk about as well is centering care, capacity, realistic timelines, and meaningful responses when addressing the concerns of Indigenous employees, for example. So, you know, reconciliation and decolonization won't happen on a colonial time frame, right? And I have to remind myself this as somebody who works in the system, and I a lot, you know, oftentimes think I work too much. Working too much, ironically, to get out of a system so that I don't have to work too much, or so that future generations don't have to work too much. So it requires putting some real thought into, you know, the plan, and being open about how the thought or how that plan can unfold as you seek labor for reconciliation as well. So anyway, I highly recommend you read this report, because at the end, Yas provides a really you know, solid set of recommendations for how to, of course, it takes a place in the culture and art sector, but I think a lot of the lessons here can be applicable to any organizations that are seeking to be a more inclusive space. So you can't just slap inclusion on the label of your organization and say you did it. You actually have to foster like an organization that wants, you know, to keep people around. Keep these folks around.
Yeah, incredibly insightful. Such pleasure. Has to be a better word than that, you know, to explain what it's like to have a really deep and meaningful conversation with a I think highly educated, thoughtful, conscientious, decolonial, Indigenous woman who, you know, is really doing a lot to shed light on the things that we have the power to change, and to really give voice to folks that normally haven't been heard in these processes, and explain it in a way that gives us hope that things can actually change. Thank you so much, Eva, for your time and your talk with us. Before we conclude our event, the director of Resilience BC, Jane Hertig, wants to share some closing remarks and an overview of the speaker series, and again, provide thanks to Eva for her time with us. So Jane, I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Ginger. My name is Jane Hertig, and I'm part of the Resilience BC Hub. We work with members of the Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network who operate across the province on territories of over 200 First Nations. And I'm speaking to you today from the beautiful territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt Nations. You can learn more about the network at our website and find resources and tools for support. And the website is there on the screen. I also want to thank Parliamentary Secretary Singh for her opening remarks. And on behalf of the network and our Taking Action lecture partners at Simon Fraser University, I want to thank Dr. Eva Jewell and Ginger Gosnell-Meyer for the very honest and thought-provoking lecture and discussion today. Eva, your lecture reminds us of the power that we all have as individuals to be taking action, to be actively demanding that our elected representatives take action on the systemic racism within our society, and that we as a society educate ourselves, take the time, the resources are there, as you pointed out, the work has been done, and the path forward is clear. So we all just really need to make that commitment. And so I thank you very much for your words today. Thank you, Ginger, for thoughtfully guiding us through this afternoon's event and your probing questions, and to the audience for your participation and for your enthusiasm and questions also. Thank you to the ASL translators, to the folks at Public Square who made this event possible behind the scenes, and to the province of BC for funding the Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network and the Hub. We look forward to seeing you at the next Taking Action lecture, and wish you all a very peaceful, restful evening.
Bye, everyone.